The cruelest thing about money is that it remembers what people try to forget. Ethan Whitman stepped out of the elevator on the 41st floor of Ellis Whitman Capital with a leather portfolio in one hand and a smile he had practiced in the reflective doors on the way up. It was the kind of smile that had once opened boardrooms, softened bankers, and convinced people that confidence was the same thing as competence. But under the white cuffs of his tailored shirt, the fabric was fraying. His watch, still expensive enough to impress a stranger, sat too loose on his wrist. He had lost 12 pounds in 6 weeks, not from discipline, but from the slow financial starvation of a man whose empire had begun eating itself from the inside. The reception area was quiet in that expensive way only serious money could afford. No ringing phones. No frantic assistants rushing with coffee. Just glass walls, pale stone floors, a view of Manhattan sharpened by winter sunlight, and a young woman behind a walnut desk who looked at him as if she already knew the ending. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "you're 7 minutes late." Ethan's smile tightened. Traffic on FDR was a nightmare. "Ms. Ellis is aware." He glanced at the brushed brass letters mounted behind her. Ellis Whitman Capital. For a second, something about the second name pulled at him, faint as a half-remembered song, but he dismissed it. Whitman was not rare. His own name had appeared on enough doors, contracts, charity programs, and magazine features to make coincidence feel natural. "I'm here to meet whoever signs the money," he said, letting just enough charm into his voice. $3 million is a serious conversation. The assistant did not blink. "She already knows who you are." Ethan laughed softly, though the sound came out dry. "Then we're ahead of schedule." He followed her down a hallway lined with black and white photographs of old American factories, family storefronts, and rebuilt main streets. Not the usual trophies of private equity. No yachts. No golf course handshakes. No framed magazine covers shouting about disruption, as if destroying livelihoods had become a tech feature. These images were quieter, almost moral, and that irritated him more than he wanted to admit. At the end of the hall, she opened a conference room door. Inside, a long table waited beneath a strip of cool light. A carafe of water. 2 glasses. A legal pad. No pastries. No flowers. No warm performance of hospitality. Ethan sat facing the door, placed his portfolio squarely in front of him, and breathed through the panic pressing behind his ribs. 10 days. That was all he had. 10 days before payroll bounced. 10 days before suppliers filed claims. 10 days before Whitman Interiors, the company he had spent years calling his legacy, became a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails by men who loved watching other men fall. He opened the folder and reviewed the talking points again. Temporary liquidity issue. Strong brand equity. Short-term bridge financing. Asset-backed opportunity. The phrases looked solid on paper, little sandbags against a flood. Behind the mirrored glass on the far wall, Claire Whitman stood with her arms folded, watching him. She had known his shoulders before they rounded under stress. She had known that hand before it trembled over financial projections. She had once watched him sign anniversary cards with the same pen motion he now used to revise lies into language a lender might accept. For 8 years, Ethan had been the man who said she did not understand business. Now he had walked into her office to beg for a loan, and he still had no idea the woman across the desk was the one he had left with nothing. Claire did not move when Margaret entered the conference room on the other side of the glass and placed a slim tablet in front of Ethan. "Ms. Ellis is reviewing your materials," Margaret said. "She asked that you walk through the request from the beginning." Ethan's jaw shifted, the smallest sign of annoyance, the old reflex of a man who believed explaining himself was something other people did. "The beginning is simple," he said, opening his portfolio with careful hands. "Whitman Interiors has a temporary cash flow problem caused by delayed receivables, rising material costs, and a client who postponed final payment on a large commercial installation in Miami." He slid a glossy packet across the table, though no one had asked for it. "We are not failing. We are undercapitalized at the wrong moment." Behind the glass, Claire almost smiled. It was a beautiful sentence, polished until it hid more than it revealed. She had written sentences like that for him once, back when she still believed marriage meant standing beside someone, not disappearing behind him. Ethan tapped the first page with his index finger. "We need a $3 million bridge facility for 90 days, secured against receivables and 2 warehouse properties in New Jersey. Once the Miami payment clears, the line can be retired in full. Margaret listened without expression. And payroll? Ethan blinked. Payroll is current. Claire looked down at the internal report on her screen. Payroll was current only because Ethan had delayed vendor payments for 43 days, borrowed against equipment he no longer fully owned, and used customer deposits to cover executive expenses. The numbers did not scream. Numbers rarely did. They sat quietly in columns and waited for someone honest enough to read them. Your bank declined to extend your credit line, Margaret said. Ethan leaned back, performing calm with the commitment of a stage actor who had forgotten half his lines. Banks are conservative. They do not understand founder-led companies. 3 banks declined, Margaret corrected, and 1 private lender withdrew after due diligence. A thin flush climbed Ethan's neck. Claire remembered that flush. It used to appear when a waiter corrected his wine choice, when a contractor asked Claire a question instead of him, when reality had the nerve to interrupt the version of himself he preferred. That lender did not understand the brand. Ethan said, "The brand has value." Claire's eyes moved to the photographs on the packet: marble kitchens, bright showrooms, elegant hotel lobbies, all built around a design language she had created at their dining room table while Ethan slept upstairs. Warm minimalism, she had called it. Human luxury. Ethan had laughed then and said, "That sounds like something from a candle label." 6 months later, he used the phrase in a pitch meeting and landed their first 7-figure client. Margaret scrolled on the tablet. Your former chief financial officer resigned in March. Personal reasons. His resignation letter cited concerns about reporting accuracy. Ethan's mouth hardened. He was overwhelmed. Claire remembered the former chief financial officer too, a nervous man named Peter who used to send her quiet emails during the early years, asking whether Ethan had approved purchase orders he claimed not to recognize. Back then, Claire had answered at midnight, smoothing over gaps, protecting Ethan from consequences she mistook for stress. Love could make a woman generous. Fear could make her efficient. Together, they made excellent unpaid labor. Ethan reached for the water glass, but did not drink. I came here because your firm has a reputation for moving fast when traditional lenders freeze. I was told Ms. Ellis looks at the whole story, not just a spreadsheet. At that, Claire finally turned away from the glass. The whole story. He had no idea how dangerous that phrase was in a room where she owned the files, the fund, and the silence. Margaret stood. Please wait here. Ms. Ellis will join you shortly. Ethan adjusted his cuffs, lifted his chin, and tried to rebuild himself before the door opened. Claire watched him for one more breath, then picked up the folder bearing his company name. For years, he had told the world she did not understand business. In less than 1 minute, he was going to learn she understood his better than he ever had. Claire stepped away from the mirrored glass and walked toward the conference room with the folder pressed lightly against her palm, as if it contained an ordinary loan request and not the ruins of a life she had once been told to be grateful for. The hallway seemed longer than usual, though she knew every inch of it. The pale stone floor, the framed photograph of a rebuilt textile mill in North Carolina, the quiet hum of climate control above her head. She had chosen every detail of that office to remind herself what money was supposed to do when it was held by responsible hands. It was supposed to preserve what deserved saving. It was supposed to protect families, workers, names, and futures from careless men who treated companies like trophies and people like furniture. At the door, she paused for half a second, not because she was afraid, but because memory had terrible timing. It gave her Ethan at 34, standing in their old kitchen in Greenwich with his tie loosened and his eyes bright, telling her their first major client had said yes. It gave her the smell of burnt coffee at 2 in the morning, the blue glow of a laptop, her own hands rewriting his proposal while he slept. It gave her the first time he had introduced her at a business dinner as my wife, Claire, with the small pause afterward where her work should have been. Then memory gave her the day he stopped coming home before midnight, the faint trace of unfamiliar perfume on his jacket, the way he had smiled when she asked about Vanessa Hart and said, "You are tired, Claire. Do not invent problems because you feel left behind." That sentence had done more damage than shouting ever could. It had made her question the evidence of her own life. She opened the door. Ethan looked up, irritation already prepared on his face, the expression of a man ready to charm, challenge, or dismiss whoever had kept him waiting. Then he saw her. For one strange, silent moment, he did not understand what his eyes were telling him. His gaze moved from her face to the folder in her hand, then to the brass pin clipped neatly to its cover, then back to her face as if the room itself had betrayed him. Claire. Her name came out smaller than she remembered, stripped of command. She closed the door behind her. Mr. Whitman. The formality landed between them like a signed document. He stood too quickly, his chair rolling back a few inches across the carpet. What are you doing here? Claire placed the folder on the table and sat across from him. Not beside him, not behind him, across. I reviewed your request. His mouth opened, then closed. For years, Ethan had made a career out of finding language before anyone else in the room. Now words seemed to arrive late and poorly dressed. You work here. I am the managing partner. He gave a short laugh that carried no humor. Ellis Whitman Capital. He looked toward the letters visible through the glass wall, then back at her. Whitman. It is still my legal name. I thought you would have changed it. Claire folded her hands on top of the file. I considered it. Then I realized I had already paid too much for it to throw it away. Color moved across his face, a mixture of embarrassment and calculation. She could almost see him adjusting strategy, sorting through old versions of her, searching for the one most useful to him now. The forgiving wife. The wounded woman. The quiet helper. The woman who would soften if he lowered his voice. Claire, he said, and this time he tried warmth. This is unexpected. Most consequences are. He lowered himself back into the chair, smoothing his tie as if fabric could restore hierarchy. I hope we can keep this professional. That is why I am here. She opened the folder. Your company is not experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. It is structurally insolvent without immediate intervention. Your receivables are overstated, your vendor exposure is dangerous, and 2 of the assets listed as collateral are already pledged. Ethan stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he had never believed she could learn. You have been busy. No, Claire said quietly. I have been accurate. The word changed the air in the room. Outside the glass, Manhattan continued its indifferent glitter, yellow cabs sliding along the avenues 41 floors below, people buying coffee, checking phones, making ordinary mistakes. Inside, Ethan Whitman sat across from the woman he had once called too emotional for business, listening as she read his collapse line by line. Ethan stared at the pages as if the numbers had personally betrayed him. For several seconds, the only sound in the conference room was the soft mechanical breath of the building and the distant murmur of Manhattan sealed behind thick glass. Claire waited. She had learned, in finance and in divorce, that silence made dishonest people uncomfortable faster than accusation ever could. Ethan finally looked up. Those assets are pledged because that is how expansion works. Expansion is not the same as survival, Claire said. You borrowed against future income that was never guaranteed. You treated deposits as operating cash. You delayed vendor payments while maintaining executive spending at a level your balance sheet could not support. His eyes narrowed. You sound like every banker who lacks vision. No, she said, turning one page. I sound like the person who read the loan file. The old Ethan flickered then, polished and defensive, the man who could turn criticism into an insult and make the room feel rude for noticing facts. Claire, let us not pretend this is purely analytical. You and I have history. We do. Then you know what this company means. Her fingers stilled on the page. What it means. The phrase moved through her like cold air under a door. Once, Whitman Interiors had meant possibility. It had meant a folding table in the guest room, paint samples spread beside unpaid bills, takeout containers stacked by the printer, and the foolish, tender belief that building something together made 2 people harder to break. She remembered their first showroom in Stamford, 900 square feet with uneven lighting and a back office that smelled faintly of dust no matter how often she cleaned it. Ethan had stood in the doorway on opening morning and told her, one day, people will say my name when they talk about taste. She had laughed because she thought he meant their name. She had been young enough to mistake proximity for partnership. I know exactly what the company means, she said. That is why I know how badly you damaged it. His expression shifted, not remorse, not yet, but the first dull alarm of a man realizing charm had no collateral value here. I made mistakes. You made choices. Every founder takes risks. You took risks with other people's paychecks. He looked toward the glass wall, then back at her, lowering his voice as if intimacy could be summoned like a waiter. Claire, I am asking you to see the bigger picture. If Whitman Interiors collapses, 186 employees lose their jobs. Vendors in Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all of them take a hit. Families suffer. You know I would not be here unless I had no other option. There it was, finally. Not an apology. Not accountability. A moral hostage note dressed as concern. Claire had heard versions of it from men in better suits and worse circumstances. Save me, or the innocent people around me will pay for what I did. She closed the folder halfway. You are right about the employees. That is the only reason this meeting continued past the first 10 minutes. Ethan leaned forward, hope returning too quickly to his face. Then we can structure something. We can. He exhaled, almost smiling. Good. I knew you would be reasonable. Claire studied him, that familiar confidence creeping back before he had earned even an inch of relief. It was astonishing how little some people needed before they rebuilt their throne out of air. She opened a second folder, thinner than the first, bound with a black clip. But not the way you requested. The smile faded. What does that mean? Ellis Whitman Capital will not issue a $3 million bridge loan under your control. Your company cannot service more debt, and your management has become the primary risk factor. His face hardened. That is absurd. It is accurate. You cannot expect me to hand over my company. Claire slid the first document across the table. I expect you to read the terms. The fund is prepared to purchase the senior debt from your primary lender, settle critical vendor balances, guarantee payroll for the next 8 weeks, and provide operating capital during restructuring. Ethan did not touch the document. And in exchange, you resign as chief executive officer. Effective immediately, the room seemed to shrink around him. For the first time since she entered, Ethan looked less like a man negotiating money and more like a man watching a mirror turn into a window. Through it, he could finally see himself from the outside. You are doing this to punish me, he said. Claire met his eyes. No. If I wanted revenge, I would have let the banks finish what you started. Ethan's eyes stayed on the document, but Claire could tell he was no longer reading. He was measuring losses, not clauses. The difference was familiar. When a man like Ethan said a company was his life, what he often meant was that the company had been the largest mirror he owned, and now someone had turned that mirror toward the truth. Effective immediately, he repeated, his voice low. You expect me to walk away from the company I founded. Claire looked at the skyline beyond his shoulder, where the Hudson River flashed silver between towers of glass and steel. I expect you to stop confusing ownership with stewardship. His mouth tightened. That sounds like something from one of those leadership books people buy at airports. It sounds like something a payroll department understands. He pushed the document back an inch, as though distance might weaken it. You do not know what it took to build this. Claire let the sentence settle. It would have hurt once. It would have opened the old wound, the one he had trained her to hide beneath politeness and good posture. But pain, left alone long enough, sometimes hardened into evidence. I know exactly what it took, she said. It took 2 maxed-out credit cards in the first year. It took my grandmother's $12,000, which you called seed capital in meetings and family money when your mother asked about it. It took me calling suppliers from our kitchen table while you practiced your investor pitch in the dining room mirror. It took weekends in empty showrooms, sample boards stacked in the trunk of my car, and client dinners where you accepted praise for ideas you had asked me to explain to you an hour earlier. Ethan went still, not because he had forgotten, but because he had hoped she had. Claire, he said carefully, we both contributed. Yes, we did. She opened the black-clipped folder. But only one of us disappeared from the paperwork. The conference room seemed to lose a degree of warmth. Ethan looked at the folder now with something closer to caution. Claire removed a copy of an old loan agreement and placed it beside the restructuring proposal. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, a small, ugly relic from a life that had once looked expensive enough to be safe. Do you recognize this? He glanced down, then away. Too quickly. It was years ago. It was 4 months before you filed for divorce. That loan was paid. Eventually, after collections contacted me because my name was listed as guarantor. His face shifted. You sign documents all the time. Not this one. The words were calm, almost gentle, which made them heavier. Ethan's hand moved toward the page, then stopped. Claire had spent years imagining this moment differently. In the early days after the divorce, when sleep came in broken pieces and shame sat beside her like a second body, she imagined shouting. She imagined showing up at one of his glossy events and telling everyone what he had done. She imagined dramatic justice, the kind people pretend they do not enjoy while clicking on it at midnight. But real justice, she had learned, was less theatrical. It was organized. It had tabs. It waited until the room was quiet enough for the truth to be heard. Daniel Brooks reviewed it, she continued. The signature does not match my authenticated records. The bank officer who approved it left the institution 2 years later. I had enough to pursue it. Ethan swallowed. Why did you not? Because at the time, I was rebuilding my life with less than $6,000 in savings, a damaged credit profile, and a lawyer I could barely afford. I had to choose between proving what you did and surviving it. For the first time, he did not answer. The old machinery had stalled. No charm, no correction, no elegant insult disguised as reason. Just Ethan Whitman, sitting in a chair too expensive for the man he had become, looking at the woman whose name he had once treated like collateral. Claire slid the restructuring proposal back toward him. Today, I am not choosing between those things. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt crowded with every version of Claire who had once sat alone at a kitchen table, trying to make sense of bills that arrived with her name attached to decisions she had never made. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the old loan agreement, but his face had changed. The shock was fading, replaced by something smaller and more human. Not humility exactly, but the first uncomfortable awareness that the past had kept receipts. I did not think it would follow you like that, he said. Claire almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sentence was so perfectly Ethan. Even now, the damage had become an inconvenience he had underestimated, not a wrong he had committed. Debt follows people, she said. That is one of the things you taught me. He rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked toward the window, where sunlight broke across the tops of midtown buildings as if the city had no interest in private reckonings. Vanessa said it was standard. The attorney said spouses signed things all the time. Everything was moving fast. Claire watched him reach for excuses the way a drowning man reached for floating wood. Vanessa, the attorney. Speed. Pressure. Never greed. Never entitlement. Never the easy cruelty of assuming the woman beside him would absorb whatever he refused to carry. You were not confused, Claire said. You were protected. There is a difference. His eyes returned to hers. I was trying to keep the company alive. So was I? The difference is that I did it without hiding behind someone else's signature. The door opened softly before he could answer, and Daniel Brooks stepped inside with the calm, precise energy of a man who made powerful people nervous without ever raising his voice. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, navy suit, thin folder under one arm. Ethan's posture stiffened at once. Men like Ethan knew lawyers the way sailors knew weather. Mr. Whitman, Daniel said. Daniel Brooks, counsel for Ellis Whitman Capital. Ethan did not stand. Is this necessary? Daniel placed the folder beside Claire. Very. Claire did not look at Daniel. She kept her attention on Ethan because this moment was not about intimidation. It was about clarity. The restructuring offer is separate from the old loan issue, she said. I am not using that document to force your signature today. I want that understood. Ethan gave a bitter smile. That is generous. No, Claire said. It is clean. The word seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Clean meant she would not become him. Clean meant no backroom. Threats. No whispered smear campaign. No financial trap set inside a marriage and detonated during a divorce. Clean meant she had built power and then disciplined herself enough not to misuse it. Daniel opened his folder. The offer gives you 24 hours to accept. If you decline, the fund withdraws. Your primary lender proceeds as scheduled. Vendor claims continue. Payroll risk remains unresolved. If you accept, you step down as chief executive officer, retain a minority non-voting interest subject to performance review, and cooperate fully with the transition team. Ethan stared at him, then at Claire. You already have a transition team. I have employees who need checks to clear on Friday, Claire said. I did not have the luxury of waiting for your pride to become reasonable. Something in his face tightened at the mention of payroll, perhaps because he understood at last that she was not bluffing, or perhaps because the word Friday sounded more real than insolvency. Friday was not a concept. Friday was rent, groceries, child care, gas, prescriptions, ordinary American life balanced on the edge of a founder's ego. And if I sign, he said slowly, what happens to me? Claire closed the old loan agreement and slid it back into the black folder. That is the first honest question you have asked today. He looked wounded by that, which was almost impressive, considering the ruins around him had mostly been arranged by his own hands. Claire leaned back, her voice steady. You leave the room with less control than you had when you entered. You also leave with a company that still exists, employees who still have jobs, and a chance to be remembered as someone who finally stepped aside before the damage became permanent. Ethan's eyes lowered to the restructuring proposal. The pen lay beside it, black and gold, ordinary and terrible. For years, he had signed documents that shaped other people's lives without feeling their weight. Now the weight had arrived. Ethan did not pick up the pen immediately. He looked at it the way people look at a hospital bill, a final notice, a locked door, something ordinary that has suddenly become the shape of their future. Claire could see the negotiations still happening behind his eyes, not with her, but with the last surviving pieces of his pride. He had always believed there would be another room, another investor, another friend from a club in Greenwich, another banker willing to confuse his last name with stability. Men like Ethan were raised to believe the world had trapdoors for them, hidden exits built beneath every failure. But this time, the floor was solid. Daniel stood beside the table without impatience. Margaret waited beyond the glass, tablet in hand, already coordinating the calls that would follow if Ethan signed. Claire had planned for every outcome because planning had once been the only thing standing between her and ruin. She had learned to respect calendars, wire deadlines, vendor terms, court filings, credit reports, and the brutal little clocks hidden inside every financial disaster. Ethan had spent years mistaking urgency for importance. Claire had learned the difference. What happens to Vanessa? Ethan asked suddenly. The name entered the room with less force than Claire expected. Once, it would have tightened her throat. Now it sounded almost administrative, like a line item from an old expense report. Vanessa is not part of this offer, Claire said. She resigned from the board last month and withdrew $240,000 in consulting fees during the last fiscal year. The transition team will review those payments. Ethan flinched, not out of loyalty, but because the number was new to him. She told me those invoices were deferred compensation. She told several people several things. Claire did not soften the sentence. There was no cruelty in it, only the clean edge of fact. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor left in him. I suppose you think I deserve this. Claire looked at him for a long moment. The easy answer would have been yes. It would have tasted sharp and satisfying for perhaps 3 seconds. But she had not survived all those years simply to become a woman who fed on the collapse of a man who had once failed her. I think the employees deserve better, she said. I think the vendors deserve to be paid. I think clients deserve the work they were promised. And I think you deserve the truth, whether you like it or not. His eyes moved to the old loan folder again. Are you going to use that against me? Not today. That is not an answer. It is the only one you have earned. Daniel shifted slightly, but Claire raised one hand, quiet and small, and he remained still. This part was hers. I have carried that document for years, she said. At first because I wanted proof that I was not crazy. Then because I thought proof would give me peace. It did not. Peace came later, when I stopped waiting for you to admit what you had done and started building a life that did not require your confession. Ethan's face lowered, and for the first time, he looked older than 42. Not ruined, not redeemed, just older, as if the version of himself he had been selling had finally expired. I did not know you had become this, he said. No, Claire replied. You did not know I had always been this. The sentence sat between them, simple enough to fit on paper, heavy enough to rewrite a decade. Ethan reached for the pen. His hand was steady now, but not from confidence. From surrender. He turned the first page, then the second, scanning clauses that transferred authority away from him line by line. When he reached the signature block, his thumb paused over his printed name. Ethan James Whitman, founder, chief executive officer. For years, those words had been armor. Now they were a costume left on a chair after the party ended. He signed. The pen scratched across the paper, small and final. Claire did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the ink dry, Because sometimes justice did not arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrived in a conference room, under fluorescent light, with a signature from a man who had finally run out of people to blame. The signature changed the room before anyone moved. It did not thunder. It did not announce itself with music or mercy. It simply sat there in fresh black ink, reducing years of arrogance to a line at the bottom of a page. Ethan placed the pen down carefully, almost respectfully, as if he had finally understood that paper could be heavier than stone. Daniel stepped forward, reviewed the signature, and added a small mark beside the final clause. "We will countersign after lender confirmation," he said. "Margaret will coordinate the immediate notices." Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed on Claire. "So that is it." The question sounded strange coming from him. Ethan had always preferred beginnings, launches, openings, ribbon cuttings, champagne photographs, anything that made him look like the first man to discover ambition. Endings had been for other people to clean up. Claire closed the folder with both hands. "For this meeting, yes. And for us." There it was, the old human trick, reaching for sentiment when strategy failed. Claire felt no anger rise, only a tired recognition, as if he had offered her a key to a house that had already burned down and expected gratitude because the metal still shined. "There is no us, Ethan." He looked away first. Beyond the glass wall, Margaret was already on the phone, her voice low and efficient. Within the next hour, notices would move through secure inboxes. A lender in Charlotte would receive a purchase offer. A payroll provider in New Jersey would get confirmation of funding. A warehouse manager in Secaucus would learn that Friday checks were safe. None of those people would know that their week had been decided inside a room where two former spouses sat across from each other like opposing chapters in the same book. Maybe that was the only decent part of power, Claire thought. When used correctly, it spared strangers from the drama that created the crisis. Ethan pushed his chair back and stood, slower this time. He gathered his empty portfolio, though most of what mattered had been left on the table. At the door, he paused. "I thought you hated me." Claire looked at him, really looked, and saw not the brilliant founder from magazine profiles, not the husband who had humiliated her with polished lies, not even the desperate borrower who had walked in that morning. She saw a man who had built his life around being admired and had mistaken admiration for love, control for leadership, and silence for consent. It was almost sad. "Almost. I did," she said. "For a while. Then I got busy." The answer seemed to wound him more than any accusation could have. Hatred would have meant he still occupied a room inside her. Busyness meant she had rented the space to something useful. He gave a faint nod, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. Margaret was waiting to escort him out, not unkindly, but without the deference he had once expected from every room he entered. Claire watched him walk past the photographs of rebuilt factories and family storefronts, his reflection sliding across the glass beside them, thinner now, less certain, finally part of a world that did not bend simply because he needed it to. When the elevator doors closed behind him, Daniel remained quiet for a moment. "You handled that cleanly," he said. Claire looked down at the old loan agreement still tucked beneath the black clip. "Clean does not mean painless." "No," Daniel said. "It usually means expensive." A small breath of laughter escaped her before she could stop it. Not joy, not triumph, just the release of a body that had carried a weight for so long it had mistaken heaviness for posture. She walked to the window. Far below, Manhattan moved with its usual indifference. Delivery trucks, taxis, pedestrians with paper coffee cups, everyone rushing toward some private emergency. 6 years earlier, Claire had arrived in Boston with less than $6,000, a damaged credit score, 2 suitcases, and a terror so complete she could barely open her mail. She had learned finance because fear had made ignorance too expensive. She had rebuilt herself not in one cinematic moment, but invoice by invoice, class by class, client by client, until one morning she woke up and realized survival had quietly become authority. Behind her, Daniel gathered the documents. "The transition call is in 20 minutes. Claire nodded, still facing the city. "Then let us make sure the employees hear it from us before they hear rumors." Because that was the difference, she thought, between taking power and earning it. Taking power made people afraid. Earning it made people safer. And for the first time that day, Claire allowed herself to touch the brass nameplate at the edge of the table, the one Ethan had not noticed when he walked in. Claire Whitman, managing partner. He had once used her name as collateral. Now her name was the reason his company still had a tomorrow. The transition call lasted 37 minutes, though Claire knew most of the people listening would remember only the first sentence. Payroll was safe. Everything after that was process, oversight, interim leadership, vendor stabilization, client retention, careful language arranged like sandbags around a shaken company. She spoke from the same conference room where Ethan had signed away control, but the air felt different now, less haunted by him and more crowded with the people who had never been invited into his version of the story. On the screen were department heads from Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, faces tired from weeks of rumor and late invoices, warehouse managers in fleece jackets, project coordinators sitting under fluorescent lights, designers calling from half-finished job sites where plastic sheeting still covered custom cabinets. They did not need poetry. They needed Friday to arrive without humiliation. Claire gave them that first. "Your checks will clear on schedule," she said. Several people visibly exhaled. One woman in accounts payable pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked down, and Claire felt the small ache behind her ribs that came whenever money stopped being abstract. $3 million looked impressive in a headline. To ordinary people, money was a mortgage payment in Fairfield County, a daycare bill in Edison, a truck repair outside Allentown, insulin picked up before work, groceries bought without moving numbers between cards. Ethan had once talked about capital as if it were weather, something grand and impersonal that swept through markets. Claire had learned that capital was more like plumbing. If it failed, everyone downstream suffered first. After the call, the office settled into motion. Margaret moved through the glass corridor with 2 phones and the expression of a woman preventing 12 disasters before lunch. Daniel disappeared into a lender call. By 4 in the afternoon, the senior debt purchase had been acknowledged, critical vendors had received payment schedules, and an interim operating officer named Rebecca Lang had accepted the temporary chief executive role. Rebecca was 51, practical, respected, and allergic to speeches, which made Claire trust her immediately. Ethan sent one email at 5:16 in the evening. The subject line read simply, "Claire." She did not open it right away. That was new. Years earlier, a message from him would have pulled her attention like an alarm. Now it sat in her inbox beneath a vendor confirmation and above a calendar invite, reduced at last to its proper size. When she finally clicked it, the message contained 4 sentences. He said he had not understood the extent of the damage. He said he hoped the employees would be all right. He said he was sorry for how the meeting ended. He did not say he was sorry for the years before it. Claire read it twice, not because it moved her, but because she wanted to see whether any part of her still waited for the apology she had once believed would unlock the door to peace. Nothing opened. Nothing broke. The room remained steady. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside, Manhattan leaned into evening, windows turning gold one by one. The city performing its daily trick of making ambition look beautiful from a distance. She closed the email without replying. Some messages did not require an answer. Some were not meant to begin a conversation, only to confirm that silence had changed owners. At 6:30, Claire took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, a security guard wished her good night. The revolving doors pushed her into a cold February wind that smelled of rain, exhaust, and roasted nuts from a street cart on the corner. She walked 2 blocks instead of calling a car, letting the city noise loosen the stiffness in her shoulders. Her phone buzzed once. A text from Rebecca. "First all hands tomorrow at 9. We will keep it plain." Claire smiled faintly. Plain was good. Plain meant no founder mythology, no heroic rescue story, no dramatic reinvention package for public relations. Just adults cleaning up what ego had made expensive. At the curb, she paused as traffic moved in bright lines along Madison Avenue. For the first time all day, she thought not of Ethan, not of Vanessa, not of the old loan agreement, but of the young woman she had been, sitting on the floor of a nearly empty apartment in Boston with unopened bills beside her and a blanket around her shoulders because heat cost money. She wished she could reach back and tell that woman one thing. The life you are building quietly will one day speak louder than the man who tried to narrate your failure. By 7:15 that evening, Claire was back in her apartment on the Upper West Side, standing barefoot in a kitchen that was quiet enough to let the refrigerator sound important. The place was not enormous, Not the kind of penthouse Ethan would have once considered proof of victory, but it was hers in every meaningful way. The mortgage was in her name. The art on the walls had been chosen because she liked it, not because a decorator said it photographed well. The books on the shelves were arranged badly and honestly. A navy coat hung over the back of a chair because no one lived there who would call ordinary disorder a flaw in character. Claire set her keys in a ceramic bowl by the door and let the day settle around her. For years after the divorce, she had expected triumph to feel loud. She had imagined that if she ever stood above Ethan in any room, if she ever held the kind of power he had once used to make her feel small, something inside her would burst open with satisfaction. But the truth was quieter and stranger. Victory felt like being tired and still able to breathe. It felt like opening mail without fear. It felt like making tea because she wanted tea, not because her hands needed something to do besides tremble. She filled the kettle, watched water collect against stainless steel, and remembered the Boston apartment again. The first winter there had been brutal, the kind of cold that found every crack around the windows and made the floorboards feel hostile. She had worn socks to bed and kept a spreadsheet of every dollar: rent, utilities, groceries, minimum payments, bus fare, legal fees, coffee only. On Fridays if the numbers allowed it. Her credit score had looked like an accusation. Her name, once printed on charity invitations beside Ethan's, had become attached to collection notices and careful apologies to landlords. No one clapped when she rebuilt. There were no flowers, no orchestral swell, no glamorous moment where the wounded woman became powerful by walking through a set of double doors in perfect lighting. There were community college finance courses, free library workshops, spreadsheets with formulas she kept breaking, clients who ignored her emails until she learned to make her language sharper. There was a retired banker named Ruth Kaplan who taught a small business lending class in a church basement on Tuesday nights, and once told Claire, "People do not lose everything all at once. They lose one document at a time." Claire had written that sentence down. She had lived by it. She had also learned the reverse was true. People rebuilt one document at a time. One lease reviewed before signing. One invoice sent on schedule. One credit report disputed. One client retained. One bank account opened without anyone else's name attached to it. The kettle clicked off. Claire poured hot water over chamomile and stood at the counter while steam rose in soft white ribbons. Her phone lit up again, this time with a message from Margaret. The lender confirmation had arrived. Funds would move by morning. Payroll was locked. Claire closed her eyes for 1 second, allowing herself that small relief. Not because Ethan had signed. Not because his pride had cracked. Because 186 people would wake up tomorrow with one less private terror sitting on their chest. That mattered. Maybe more than anything else that had happened in the conference room. She carried the mug to the living room and sat beside the window. Across the street, a family in another building was eating dinner, silhouettes moving behind warm curtains, someone passing a plate, someone laughing at something too far away to hear. Claire watched them with a tenderness that surprised her. Once, she had believed losing a marriage meant losing the shape of a life. Now she understood that. Some shapes were cages drawn with elegant lines. Her phone rested face down on the table. Ethan's email remained unanswered. The old loan agreement was locked in Daniel's file system. Tomorrow would bring meetings, restructuring plans, difficult calls, and 100 practical decisions that would never fit inside a dramatic retelling. But tonight, the apartment was warm, the tea was bitter in the way she liked, and her name belonged only to her. Ethan had come asking for money. What he had found was the woman he had underestimated, not angry enough to destroy him, not soft enough to save his ego, and not lost enough to need his regret. Claire lifted the mug in both hands and looked out at the city. For the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel like something taken from her. It felt like something she had earned. The next morning arrived without drama, which made it more useful than most dramatic mornings. Claire woke at 5:48 before her alarm, not because she was rested, but because responsibility had a way of standing beside the bed and clearing its throat. Outside her window, the Upper West Side was still blue with early light, the sidewalks damp from overnight rain, the city not yet fully committed to noise. She made coffee, reviewed the overnight lender confirmation, and read Rebecca Lang's first transition memo while standing at the kitchen counter in socks. It was plain, direct, and mercifully free of heroic language. Cash controls effective immediately. Executive spending paused. Vendor outreach prioritized by operational dependency. Client communication drafted for approval. Ethan's name appeared only twice, both times in reference to access transfer. Claire appreciated that. A person could be important to a crisis without deserving to remain the center of it. By 8:35, she was back on the 41st floor, and Ellis Whitman Capital felt less like a courtroom and more like an engine. Margaret had already built a schedule so tight it looked punitive, which meant it was probably perfect. Daniel was in the small conference room with two outside attorneys. Rebecca joined the all-hands call from the Stanford showroom. Standing in front of a wall of fabric samples with her reading glasses on her head and no patience for fear disguised as gossip, Claire watched from her office as employees filled the screen again. More faces this time. Shop supervisors, junior designers, purchasing staff, delivery coordinators, people whose names had likely never appeared in Ethan's investor decks, though their labor had made those decks believable. Rebecca spoke first. The company is open. Payroll is funded. Jobs in progress continue. There will be changes, but there will not be chaos. Claire could have kissed the sentence on the forehead if sentences had foreheads, which, thankfully for civilization, they do not. The relief on the screen was not theatrical. It moved quietly through shoulders dropping, heads nodding, someone wiping under one eye before pretending to adjust glasses. Then questions came, practical and frightened. Would the Philadelphia hotel project continue? Yes. Would the warehouse layoffs happen? Not this week, and not without review. Would vendors stop deliveries? Critical vendors had already been contacted. Was Ethan still involved? Rebecca paused, and Claire saw an entire company lean toward the answer. Mr. Whitman has stepped down from executive leadership, Rebecca said. The transition team has operational control. No one cheered. No one gasped. They simply absorbed it, as working people do, because survival rarely leaves time for theatrical reactions. After the call, Claire drove with Rebecca to the Stanford showroom. She had not been there in nearly 7 years. The building looked smaller than memory, a 2-story brick space with tall windows and a polished sign Ethan had once insisted should be backlit because prestige, apparently, could be purchased in electrical upgrades. Inside, the scent of wood polish, fabric, and fresh paint struck Claire so sharply that she had to stop near the entrance. For a moment she was 30 again, carrying sample books in from the parking lot, her wrists aching, her heart foolishly bright because she thought exhaustion shared with a husband became love. A young receptionist looked up. Ms. Whitman. Claire smiled. Claire is fine. The receptionist seemed startled by the kindness, which told Claire more about the old culture than any audit could. Rebecca led her through the showroom, past staged living rooms, kitchen displays, and a conference area where 3 designers looked up from tablets with the wary politeness of people waiting to find out whether the new boss had arrived with a sword hidden inside a spreadsheet. Claire stopped by a sample table. There, beneath a stack of updated catalogs, was an old design board labeled Human Luxury, the phrase faded but still legible in black marker. Her handwriting. Her stomach tightened, not with grief this time, but recognition. Some part of her had remained here all along, not as a ghost, but as a foundation no one had bothered to credit because foundations are useful precisely when no one has to look at them. Rebecca noticed her looking. Do you want that thrown out? Claire touched the edge of the board, remembering Ethan laughing at the phrase before selling it as genius. No, she said. Frame it. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. For the lobby? Claire looked around the showroom, at the employees pretending not to listen, at the company still breathing despite the man who had nearly spent it into extinction. For the lobby, she said, but remove his quote beneath it. This time, let the work speak under the correct name. 3 months later, the sign outside the Stanford showroom came down on a bright May morning while traffic moved along the post road and a delivery truck idled near the curb with its hazard lights blinking. Claire stood on the sidewalk in a cream blazer, holding a paper coffee cup that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes earlier, watching 2 installers lift the old black letters from the brick facade. Whitman Interiors had once looked permanent to her, the kind of name wealthy people carved into stone because they believed the future would be too polite to object. But permanence, she had learned, was often just neglect with better lighting. Rebecca stood beside her with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Last chance to change your mind, she said. Claire watched the first letter come loose. About the name? About all of it. Claire smiled faintly. Too late. The printers already charged us. Rebecca made a sound that was almost a laugh, which from Rebecca counted as a festival. The new sign waited inside a padded crate near the entrance, Whitman Interiors Group. Beneath it, in smaller brushed brass letters, Chairwoman, Claire Whitman. The word still felt strange, not because she doubted it, but because titles had once been something other people gave men like Ethan, while women like Claire handled the work that made the title believable. Now the title was accurate, and accuracy had become one of her favorite forms of luxury. Inside the showroom, the company looked different without pretending to be new. The staged rooms had been rearranged to feel warmer. The finance team had moved out of the windowless back office and into a proper workspace. Vendor calls were returned within 48 hours. Executive expenses were reviewed by someone who enjoyed saying no in a cheerful voice. The Philadelphia hotel project had been delivered 2 weeks late, but under revised budget. No one had been laid off. That fact mattered more to Claire than any sign on the building. Near the lobby wall, the old human luxury board had been framed in walnut, her handwriting preserved under museum glass. Beneath it was a small plaque, original concept by Claire Whitman. Not wife of, not assistant to, not supportive presence behind. Just her name attached to her work, where it should have been from the beginning. Ethan had not attended the unveiling. He had sent a short message through Daniel 2 weeks earlier, confirming that he would not contest the transition terms. No apology accompanied it. Claire had not expected one. Expecting Ethan to become emotionally precise was like expecting a chandelier to become a flashlight. Both produced light, technically, but only one was useful in the dark. Vanessa's consulting payments were still under review, and Claire had made sure the process stayed clean, documented, and boring. There would be no scandal leaked to gossip pages, no public humiliation disguised as justice. Claire had learned that some people wanted revenge because they had never tasted stability. She had tasted both, and stability was better. At 10 o'clock, employees gathered outside with paper cups of coffee, phones raised, faces cautious but hopeful. Rebecca gave a brief statement about the next phase, the kind with dates, budgets, and no decorative nonsense. Then she stepped aside and nodded to Claire. Claire had not prepared a speech. She looked at the people standing before her, designers, warehouse supervisors, project managers, accountants, reception staff, the ordinary architecture of a company no founder could honestly claim to build alone. This business survived because the people doing the work were stronger than the mistakes made above them, she said. From now on, we are going to run it like their work matters, because it does. That was all. It was enough. The installers lifted the new sign into place, and sunlight caught the brass letters one by one until her name brightened against the brick. Claire felt no rush of triumph, no cinematic swell, no need to imagine Ethan seeing it and regretting everything on command. The moment belonged to no one who had underestimated her. It belonged to the woman who had once opened bills with shaking hands, to the woman who learned balance sheets because fear had made ignorance unaffordable, to the woman who had stopped waiting for permission to become visible. As the small crowd clapped, Claire looked at the sign and thought about the meeting that had begun with a loan request and ended with a transfer of responsibility. Ethan had walked into her office asking to borrow money. What he had received was a lesson in ownership. What she had received was not revenge, not exactly. It was restoration. The company had a future. The employees had paychecks. The work had the correct name beneath it. And Claire Whitman, once treated as collateral in someone else's ambition, stood in front of the building she had helped create and finally owned the story written above the door. By late afternoon, after the employees had gone back inside and the installers had packed away their ladders, Claire remained on the sidewalk for a few minutes longer than necessary. The new sign looked almost modest in the May light, which pleased her. Ethan would have wanted something larger, brighter, more theatrical, the kind of branding that made a building announce itself before it had earned the right. Claire preferred the quiet certainty of brass against brick. It did not beg to be seen. It simply remained. Rebecca came out carrying 2 folders and a paper bag from the cafe down the block. "You missed lunch," she said, handing Claire the bag. Again, Claire looked inside. Turkey sandwich, kettle chips, bottled water. Is this leadership or surveillance? Operational concern. That sounds worse. It is. Claire smiled and took the bag. Inside the showroom, People had already started adjusting to the new reality in the practical way working people do. A designer was re-tagging fabric samples. Someone from accounting was laughing softly near the printer. The receptionist was explaining the new company name to a client over the phone with the careful pride of a person testing how good news sounds out loud. Ordinary sounds. Useful sounds. Claire stood near the framed design board in the lobby and let herself absorb them. For years, she had thought justice would be something she did to Ethan. A door closed in his face. A room forced to hear her truth. A moment when he finally understood the full cost of what he had taken. But justice had turned out to be less interested in performance than she expected. It was in the corrected plaque beneath her work. It was in the funded payroll. It was in a vendor in Pennsylvania receiving a payment plan instead of another excuse. It was in a receptionist saying the company name without flinching. Around 4:30, Daniel called. His voice carried the dry satisfaction of a man who considered complete documentation a moral victory. Vanessa's consulting payments had been flagged for further review, but there was enough cooperation from the former controller to handle it quietly and properly. Ethan's access had been fully revoked. The lender transfer was complete. No emergency remained for the day. Go home before someone invents one, Daniel said. That is not legal advice, Claire replied. It is better. It is life advice disguised as exhaustion. She ended the call and looked once more at the board. Human luxury. She had once created the phrase to describe rooms that felt beautiful without making people afraid to live in them. She realized, with a small and private ache, that she had been describing more than design. She had been describing the life she wanted. Elegant, but not cold. Valuable, but not cruel. Structured, but still human. Outside, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the showroom floor. Claire picked up her coat from the back of a chair and walked through the space slowly, past the conference table where younger designers now debated materials without lowering their voices, past the sample room where purchase orders were being sorted, past the front desk where the receptionist looked up and said, "Good night, Claire." Not Mrs. Whitman, not ma'am, not anything borrowed from a man's shadow. Just Claire. She drove back to the city without music, the windows cracked open, spring air moving through the car with the smell of cut grass, asphalt, and distant rain. On the Merritt Parkway, traffic slowed near a construction zone, and for once she did not mind. She thought about the strange mercy of delay, how some lives only reveal their direction after every route you trusted has been closed. Ethan had closed doors because he wanted control. Debt had closed doors because papers did not care about pain. Fear had closed doors because survival sometimes shrank the world to the size of a mailbox. Yet here she was, driving toward Manhattan under a brightening sky, carrying no apology from him and needing none. Her phone buzzed at a red light outside the city. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Claire, I saw the new sign. For what it is worth, it looks right." "Ethan." She read it once, then set the phone face down on the passenger seat when the light changed. The words did not undo anything. They did not heal the years or excuse the documents or restore the woman who had once waited for him to become kind. But they also did not hurt her. That was how she knew the story had finally changed. Not because he had seen her, but because whether he saw her no longer decided what she was worth. Claire drove on, hands steady on the wheel, the city rising ahead of her in glass and gold, and the silence beside her no longer felt empty. It felt open.